Um, okay, I will get started then. Hi, my name is Ria. I'm one of the Young Trustees at the Architecture Foundation. Thank you for coming. And thank you to the AF for organising the 100-Day Studio, which this is a part of. I'll stop the music video now, but that was a song called Work From Home with a video set in a construction site, so it felt quite fitting for the discussion we're about to have. This is the first in a series of conversations that we, the Architecture Foundation's Young Trustees, will be coordinating over the next few weeks, exploring the theme of architecture and activism under the title Business as Usual. I'm sure it's not escaped anybody's notice that we are in unprecedented times and business is very much not as usual right now. So the feeling among us as a group was that it was an opportune time to explore these themes as we perhaps begin to contemplate the end of lockdown. Before lockdown, a group of us had been working on a series about the climate, but based on some of the work we've been doing recently, we wanted to broaden that theme. So the series begins tonight with the theme of work, but we'll also be discussing climate and ecology, diversity and homes over the coming weeks. The impetus behind this series is to discuss ways that young architects can engage with cross-professional collaboration, new forms of practice and working structures to push for genuine change in their day-to-day work, or through the making of new spaces for activism and pushing for legislative change. So we hope we'll be able to leave each session feeling enthused about some of the opportunities that already exist to do that, and find ways of embracing what's good about working in architecture. So we're very much not the only ones looking at these types of issues at the moment. I wanted to acknowledge that the Architects Climate Action Network, ACAN, also had an event last week or the week before with the title No More Business as Usual. And I wanted to quote something that they said in their introduction. Business as usual sees us returning to a degenerative work culture, one that's destructive and exploitative in its quest for continuous growth. In order to avoid further disaster, we fundamentally cannot go back. So I'm going to do a little bit of a non-exhaustive introduction to set the scene in some of the ways that people have worked on this topic before, because I suppose a lot of these topics tend to be cyclical, after which we'll hear from our speakers about the work that they've been doing and follow that with a discussion. Whilst we're talking, if there are any questions, please keep them in mind. We'll be opening the chat for you to ask them, and then we'll come to you. We'll give you the opportunity to ask those at the end. So I'm going to do a bit of a weather person style presentation today and change my background to show you some images. So you might want to be on speaker view to be able to see the images properly. So I wanted to begin with some transparency about what led us as a group of the Young Trustees to consider the subject and embark on the series. Tonight we'll be hearing from Hannah Bernahood, who's one of the Young Trustees and who has been campaigning during lockdown for the closure of non-essential construction sites. She's made a TV appearance on The One Show to discuss this with a wider audience, and I think it's fair to say it's been quite a big learning curve. It's a very complex issue, and I think from our side of the discussion anyway, the relationship between an architect's vulnerability and influence has been quite important. We'll also hear from Dinah Bornat from the London Practice Forum, and who is also co-founder of ZCD Architects. So the London Practice Forum is a collective of small practices looking to advocate for positive change. In January, they set out a charter and a code of conduct, which covers subjects such as working hours, climate and social responsibility. Our third speakers are Jake and Catherine, who are both members of the United Voices of the World section of architectural workers, which is the first students, admin staff and technicians. So I think I'm really doing the weather reporter thing with my sheets of paper. I think it's worth noting that I think a lot of the action that we're discussing has happened or been made public at least in the last year. To me, at least, it seems that since perhaps the beginning of Architects Declare, there's been an uptick in the number of groups taking on architectural or activist causes. So I wanted to take a bit of a look back at what's come before, as I mentioned, and how we've come to the current moment. I want to ask how we can consider the social implications of the implementation of our work as well as the outcome of the work itself, and how an industry organised around fairer working practices might be able to better tackle some of the biggest issues we're facing at the moment, such as the climate emergency and social justice. I think that a lot of this discussion hinges on the way that architects consider themselves. A pervasive conversation in architectural culture, I think, since I started studying, is that of the shrinking of the architect's role and the lack of influence that we seem to find ourselves with now compared to the past. But then there's a question about what the influence has been used for historically and what dangers the lack of influence or oversight might pose. I'm hesitant to draw too many parallels, but I think that this discussion did come to a head around the Grenfell Tower inquiry, which is still ongoing. And I wanted to mention the work of Forensic Architecture, who are a research practice based at Goldsmiths University, looking to investigate human rights violations around the world. On this project, their work's quite open-ended, but they're working to visualize the information arising from the inquiry and using architectural tools to reveal and speak to the power structures that governed this tragedy. A quote from the founder, E.R. Weissman, says, "We think that architects need to be public figures. They should take positions, whatever they do. And yet it seems sometimes that architects feel unable to speak out about unfair practices for fear of losing work or making way for an even greater evil." We also obviously know that architecture frequently has a culture of long hours and unpaid overtime, partly because to many architectural work is seen as a vocational or artistic pursuit, and partly because, I guess, speaking to that idea about influence, our business model frequently undercuts on fees in order to win jobs. So this has an impact on the profession's diversity, the personal lives of architectural workers, and the nature of the work undertaken. In 1974, I'm on this side now, a group formed at the Architectural Association calling themselves the Architects' Revolutionary Council. They look to strengthen the connection between architects and the communities that they work for, stating as their goal, "We wish to create a situation whereby every time a student passes a building, at such a center point, they vow never to work in a practice involved in such obscenities. Whenever a student walks through a gentrified area where massive improvement grants have enabled landlords to evict long-standing tenants and raise the value of their property, they vow never to work in firms that indulge in such activities." They position themselves in direct opposition to the RIBA, and whilst they saw themselves as more of a catalyst or custodian of a movement rather than the movement itself, their activity led to the beginning of the New Architecture movement, established a year later in 1975. It was said about this group, the New Architecture movement has established itself as a mouthpiece for a significant section of architectural workers, and is taking a major part in the debate about the role of the architect. They argued that architecture could not be separated from its political implications and social obligations. And although these groups ultimately lost momentum in the mid-80s, it's a conversation which remains relevant today. After this, I think there's a bit of a gap, which brings us up closer to the present moment. In 2014, the architecture lobby was set up by Peggy Dinah in the US to tackle the culture of precarious work within architecture. In the image shown, they're staging a performance of their manifesto at a meeting of the American Institute of Architects. The manifesto calls for measures such as the unionization of architects and the collectivization of small practices. So it provides an interesting backdrop to the discussion that we're having today. They're now a growing network, with a UK chapter being set up at the beginning of the year, and I hope that we have a few of their members in the audience today to contribute to the discussion at the end. And now, as architects continue to work from home during lockdown, many construction sites have remained open. For most of lockdown, it's been difficult to quantify what the impact on construction workers has been. Construction is quite a casualized industry without an overarching body reporting on numbers, as we saw for transport or health workers, for example. But we now know that construction workers have been some of those hardest hit by COVID-19, which, when contextualized with the work and the movements that we've talked about so far, I want to use this as an opportunity to examine some of that ecosystem that we exist within that includes construction workers, architects, users all together. But again, this isn't the first time that that's been discussed either. In 2014, there was an outcry over deaths on construction sites in Qatar. with questions raised over the responsibility for architects to design buildings that are safe to construct. I think some of the facts about this remained a bit murky, but we were left with this quote from Zaha Hadid, who said, "It's not my duty as an architect to look at it. I cannot do anything about it because I have no power to do anything about it." And that from arguably one of the most recognizable architects that we have. So on that positive note, I think that we'll start the discussion with contributions from our panel. Or actually, I think that Jake, one of my fellow Young Trustees, had something that he wanted to add before that. So
yeah,
Jake.
it was just to pick up in Zaha Hadid's positive vein. It was also a sort of slight framing device. Reading from Maria Louise von Franz's Archetypal Patterns in Dreams, she says, "Nowadays, whenever something goes slightly wrong with us, we immediately set out to do something about it, not realizing that the more we do to correct it, the more we pile up the blackness and evil on the other side. Instead, we should always ask, is this an evil we can tolerate? One that probably, if tolerated, will balance itself out after a while. For in that case, one ought to do nothing about it." And this is the caveat. There are still plenty of situations when one clearly has to do something to fight against evil, but one should note that to do something rational against anything that is evil is a half devilish measure and more liable to disturb the balance of the whole and improve the situation. If we were to realize that, our sun would not be so bright, but its shadow would not be so dark either. So it was just to not put any cold water on brilliant activism. It was just to give hopefully a little bit of to critique to that constant, where do we put the energy to fight the old and build the new.
Great, thanks for that, Jake. I think we'll first go to Hannah to talk about the campaign. So over to you, Hannah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Okay, hi everyone. My name is Hannah Bennyhood and I am an architect and an artist. I freelance as an architect 2 days a week in a traditional practice, and then I run my own studio for the rest of the time. And I am the person who has been leading on the Shut Sites Down campaign on behalf of the Young Trustees. So this all began when we first went into lockdown, and when it first happened and the announcement was given, what seemed slightly unclear about who exactly was allowed to go out to work and who wasn't. It was sort of assumed that it was just key workers. And then quickly, the housing minister confirmed that actually construction sites were still to continue. If I'm honest, my first reaction to this was, great, it's good for me. I still have a job and everything will go on as usual. And the very next day, I went out for my sort of mandatory walk and just walked past many construction sites. I live in Tottenham Hale. I'm surrounded by construction sites, and immediately just thought, I don't think this is okay. I don't think it's okay that we are allowed to stay home and we're allowed to stay safe, and the people on site don't have that same option. That was coupled with a conversation with another architect who had a contractor call them up and ask for an extension of time because they didn't want to be on site and get all their lads on site. And the architect wasn't sure what to do. In the end, by consulting fellow architects and legal advice, a decision was made that there was no legal reason for them to actually stop work on site, and that extension was not granted. I took real issue with this. I found it not okay, but I didn't know what to specifically do about it. I reached out to the other trustees and we decided that we would at very least talk about this issue. We started a petition, but as the petition grew momentum, it was clear that even if it did reach its recommended numbers to be debated, Parliament wouldn't be debating as usual. So then we tried lots of different other avenues. We reached out to the RIBA and the ARB, who just said that they were doing acting as per government guidelines. We emailed and lobbied MPs. We spoke directly to people who were on site. We spoke to developers. We called building control. We called health and safety executive. We did everything we could think of to try and raise awareness of the issue in hand. On the 31st of March, the government wrote a public letter. Up to now, there were some developers who had voluntarily chosen to shut down construction sites. Since that letter was issued, those sites then sort of sprung back into action again. And since then, the government has released site operation procedures, which sort of give guidelines on how to act on a building site, but with the fundamental understanding still that it's not possible to social distance on site. The first site operation procedures that were released actually said that anything within 2 meters wasn't allowed, and it was abruptly taken down and changed. So just as Ria spoke about, now we have data, and I'm just going to read from my notes to make sure I don't get the numbers wrong. But these data from the Office of National Statistics that specifically look at the relation between occupations show that between the 9th of March and the 20th of April, there were 2,494 deaths within the working age population, and 2/3 of those deaths were men. But they weren't just any men, they were specifically men in low skilled occupations have the highest death rate, and that was counted in the category of elementary workers, which construction workers exist under. And the men that were affected the least were men that were counted as professionals, which architects come under. So this feels this like within our industry, the sites are still operating. I'm sure you've all seen them around, but not everywhere. Still in Scotland is no non-essential construction sites are going. So at the moment we are still trying our best to make sure that everything can be done at least to protect people on site, and that's a quick overview of the past couple of months.
I forgot to unmute myself. I said thank you for that, Hannah. That was great. I think next we'd like to hear from Dinah. If you're...
Hi, I think, hello. Did you want me to talk a little bit about the London Practice Forum?
Yeah.
Okay, well, first of all, Hannah, thank you. And well done for jumping up and springing into action at a moment in time when we were all reeling, weren't we, from how to manage our lives under lockdown. And I think it's true to say that the London Practice Forum is a group of 21 practices at the moment, all quite small, although some up to the size of 50, so you might think kind of up to medium size. And one of the things we first did when we went into lockdown within a couple of weeks was we had a meeting, and we meet usually about once a month, and that topic came up very quickly, why the construction sites were still open, and we were really concerned, but we didn't start campaigning. And so I'm grateful for people that did actually at the time, because we were quite shocked, and it was looking quite clear that anybody who wasn't in lockdown was under massive risk, especially in London, where we probably should have gone into lockdown a couple of weeks earlier to save tens of thousands of people's lives. I was looking for the data early on, and it wasn't there, was it? And I think that was what was quite revealing, is that we saw lots of information about care workers and NHS workers and bus drivers, but no stories about construction workers. So I don't think yet I've seen a story about a construction worker and their life and how they've been affected. And I think that's very much about, when you're campaigning, it's about choosing a real life story. It has a massive impact. I wasn't going to talk about that, but that side of things where I've been involved in campaigning, when you catch that, you really catch the mood of a situation, because people can relate to human beings far less to numbers. So anyway, the London Practice Forum, I think we got together because I think a lot of us in the architecture industry and I'm sure beyond, feel frustrated about the kind of context that we operate in, the procurement side of things, the fragility of the industry, which really sort of plays out in construction work as well, where you think about people who are on sort of 0 hours contracts or self-employed. So you saw straight away how vulnerable they were and how they had to keep going to work. And I think it's not exactly the same, but this is an industry which is massively competitive. We're competing all the time against each other, and I think we just felt fed up that that's the way that we were operating, and we wanted to come together and do something collectively. So we, and as you were saying, launched a charter at the beginning of the year, and that was quite an interesting kind of project for us, because we meet about once a month, and we sit around a big table, and there's quite a lot of us, and there's usually at least half the practices are there represented, and most people come kind of fairly regularly. But we meet at a director level, and because we've been going for 6 to 9 months kind of now, we hadn't got to the point yet where we wanted to see how we could bring in staff from all of our teams. And it was really unfortunate that we had our first event booked for the 30th of March, where we were going to start talking about social value and what that means to us in our different practices. And we were thinking of where that was going to go next in terms of publishing a book or a series of lectures or something. And I suppose we want to make sure that we're not doing the same thing that the Architecture Foundation might be doing, or that the RIBA might be doing, or other organisations. But we were hoping that by meeting together and getting our staff on board and really kind of coming up with a charter that sort of binds us all together, which is quite difficult to do when there's a group of 21 of you who are working quite differently in quite different sectors. It was quite a long process of kind of backwards and forwards of talking about what the different points are, and we didn't want it to be really kind of general and anodyne, if that makes sense. It needed to be something that was quite sort of specific, and that we felt that could go beyond perhaps what the RIBA Charter Practice was doing. But we also feel, I think, that we need to be judged on our actions. So we need to take time. And I think that the criticism might be that we sort of look like a clique or a cartel. And I think that's what's interesting about setting a group up, because there's a sort of certain size that you can reach before it becomes too big to actually kind of collectively have ideas. Especially if you're representing practices and lots of staff. So like the thing that really got picked up by the press, we found the easiest to kind of reach an agreement on, which was this idea that we would commit to standard working hours of no more than 40 hours a week. And we just thought, well, that's an easy one. None of us want to be working long hours, and none of us were expecting our staff to work really long hours. But for some reason, that's what the press thought was the most kind of out there, which I thought was we all thought was quite amusing. The bits that we found a bit harder, if you like, was to think about what our social values would be, and to try and write those down, because they're quite hard to sort of to be specific about. But within there's quite a lot of bureaucracy, and it might look a little bit boring, but things like having a written mental health policy and a social responsibility policy and a flexible working policy puts the responsibility on us as directors to actually start thinking about these things and writing them down and talking to our staff about them. And I think for us, it's about having a much more open way of practicing, so that we're doing these things and we're talking about them together. And the other benefits of being collective is that you're sharing best practice between you, and actually you're pushing each other to do better. And if you hear people doing things well, you think, well, we should be doing that as well, shouldn't we? So there's a good way, I think, of meeting together with like-minded people, where you can kind of push things and say, oh, I found out so-and-so is doing that, and then you can feel kind of empowered to do that as well. I mean, we've talked about the climate crisis a lot, and I think we feel that other organisations are pushing harder at that, but we definitely have to make a statement about that. So there's lots in our charter, and I think really what we want to do is to make sure that we're attracting the right kind of staff, and our staff feel valued and they want to stay. And we also have a process where when work ebbs and flows, we can kind of put people on secondment into other practices or borrow from other practices. So we like this idea of kind of keeping people part of the collective and making sure that they're not being hit by the kind of changes in the market. And even now we're doing that, I think, under coronavirus, although obviously situations are much sharper. Yeah, so I think that sort of covers what we do.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. Let's finish off with Jake and Catherine from the section of architectural workers. Yeah.
Okay. Hi everyone. Jake and I are going to tag team this one. So I'm Catherine and
I'm Jake.
Floating somewhere. We are members of the United Voices of the World section of architectural workers. We call ourselves SAW for short. We're a trade union for architectural workers in the UK. Our members support and upskill each other to make our architectural sector work fairer for workers, us, communities and our environment. So we're going to chat a little bit about what we are and what our members have been doing in response to COVID. So I'll pass to Jake.
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah. Yes, I'm going to start with this quote, and just for context, within the union, I've message my role is that part of my role is to be in an outreach working group, and so I contact members before meetings to invite them to come, but I receive lots of messages when people can't because they're working late, and this is one of them. Hey man, apologies for ghosting recently. I haven't responded in the last few messages. Guess, due to work. In the last 4 months, I've been working 9 till 8 p.m. constantly, unpaid overtime, and I've got on 1 day in lieu for all of that. Twice I didn't even bother going home. I just stayed at the office. I did not think it was worth bringing this issue to the union, as there's much worse cases. I've previously worked at Heatherwick, which he then goes on to describe as a concentration camp. That's the story. I'm really hoping to help the union more this year. I doubt my working hours, I can be at meetings, but surely there is a way I could help remotely. What do you think? I promise you I'm feeling very strongly about this. So this sort of quote points to a number of issues organising workers in the architectural sector. One is we're incredibly overworked, and it's not, and the other thing is that we don't think it's that bad, and that it's worse elsewhere. And if we're honest, it is, because we've spoken to multiple people as part of the union who are working over 90 hours in a week. So as members of the union, we're organising in our spare time, our lunch breaks, our toilet breaks after work and at weekends. And our ability to organise around employment issues is directly affected by these issues, overwork and stress.
So I'm just going to chat about what we've been doing really since the coronavirus really hit in March. We've been really upscaling organising in the workplace. So we've been building networks of solidarity within workplaces, and members have been submitting collective grievances within their own firms. And then we have sort of cross-workplace support as well. So we're working on caseworks collectively as a kind of little hive mind to address issues and process cases. We've obviously been very aware of an impending recession with the crisis, and that's just how the construction industry goes. So what we're trying to do is build in the structure now to respond to that. There's about a third of people in the recession predicted in the RBA journal that might lose their jobs. So being ready for that kind of wave is what we're trying to do. And we've been doing lots of different things to achieve that. Starting with surveying our members and phone banking. So reaching out to everyone to see what's been happening to them, to get their feedback on what they'd like to see happening moving forward. And then workers across workplaces helping each other out to try and make those things happen. We've also been hosting employment law training. So lots of specific issues around furlough, redundancy, health and safety. We've had some of the best employment law solicitors and barristers advising and educating people. Part of the education is also about, we've been producing pamphlets on workers' rights to refuse work if they feel it's unsafe to do so. we've produced template letters that workers can send to their employers, so that that's kind of like the default that's there ready in the bag to go. And we've been building relationships with other organisations, so people like the London Renters Union, because this is an issue that's affecting a myriad of people, the aspects of people's lives, and it's really compounded in London with the housing affordability crisis. When we've also been campaigning. So as we've been gathering all of this kind of news and feedback and experience from our members, we've been making sure that we get that story out there of people's actual experiences. So publishing with the AJ, National Press and The Guardian, making sure that we're heard.
Yeah, and so just to finish, I think we think it's really important that as a profession, we ask in this moment of unprecedented times, what parts of the current situation do we want to keep and what parts do we want to kind of get rid of? So there's some of the things that we want to get rid of is surveillance and micromanagement. Workers, have been reporting to us that they've been asked by their employers to keep their webcams and microphones on while they're working from home at all times. We want to get rid of the erasure of boundaries between like home and work. We want to get rid of overwork. We had a situation where one employer continued to go to work even though they had COVID symptoms, and 2/3 of the workers got sick, and the other third of the workers' workload doubled. We want to get rid of precarity, where people are told or kind of coerced into reducing their notice period to a week or face redundancy at a time of a national crisis. We want to get rid of poverty wages, so that's workers, part ones, being asked to take a 20% pay cut but increase their hours. We want to get rid of like cruel employers who are choosing to terminate their workers' contracts rather than furlough them, even though we estimate it could cost as little as like £60 a month to keep them on. And the current situation is just exacerbating all of these issues that already existed and that as workers we were already facing in the profession. But some of the things we want to keep from this crisis is the kind of flexibility. Like, it's kind of amazing that all architectural work, or like the vast majority of architectural workers, can work from home now. Like, that kind of flexibility didn't exist before. We want to keep the recognition of the social value of certain types of labor. So, if we think about what were previously so-called low-skilled workers are now considered key workers. And most importantly, we want to keep the belief that if we want to, and there's economic pressure to do so, and the way that I guess we frame that is that as workers, if we mass organize, we can completely reconstruct society overnight. I think that's the end of our presentation.
I keep forgetting to unmute myself. Great. Thank you, both of you, Catherine and Jake. It's been great to hear from all of you about the work that you're doing. I think I'd like, a reminder to everybody, we've made the chat public now, so if you have any questions, please do start to post them in there and we'll get to them soon. I'd like to start the discussion touching on the idea of fragility in the industry and precarity, that things are kind of on an edge. We do obviously already have bodies that are supposedly tasked with taking care of the profession. So I wanted to ask what your relationship with those current systems and structures are. Are there good things about the current system? Can we work within it, or do you think that we need a new one? I wonder, maybe we could go to Dinah first.
Oh, don't ask me. I like that. Mass organise. That sounds exciting. How many people are part of SAW? How many have you got on your books, Jake or Catherine?
We're around about 200 now.
Okay, and how long have you been going?
How's it been going, sorry?
How long have you been going?
Oh, Jake, you're going to have to do the founding.
It's like 5 months or something.
Okay, that's pretty good. I mean, I think we are at that point in our careers where we probably know fairly influential people, although we don't have the kind of keys to power. We can push quite hard. And I think from our perspective, and having lived through a recession that's probably not going to be as bad as this one, I have to say, in my job, it is really tough at the bottom because that's where the jobs get lost fast. But also, we have to fight at the top to make the system work better for us as practices, because it's not because we should be holding on to all the profit, but we need to make sure that we can kind of create stable companies that can hold on and protect their staff, because we don't want to be going into this now with people doing zero fee bids and out competing each other, because that usually ends up impacting the people at the bottom the hardest. And that, you know, so for example, we need to stick to our principles of having nobody under the London living wage. So that means your cleaner, your part one, that means not lowering wages during coronavirus now, and that's what we're all committed to. And that means still not using unpaid interns. So we shouldn't be expecting people to work over that 40-hour week as a standard working hour. That doesn't mean occasionally you don't do a few hours for a competition, but that, you know, we really do mean occasionally, and we have time off in lieu as well. So these things like are really important to state and name, and I think you know, by giving by kind of setting the bar higher, we can all sort of name and shame the practices that aren't doing that, and we can point the finger, if you like. It's not something we necessarily want to be doing as the London Practice Forum, but I do feel that it's something we need to call out, and we have, and I hope you do as well, kind of good connections with the media. And it's sometimes useful to jump outside our little bubble of architecture media, because I think people don't understand our industry. They don't understand, there's probably a kind of false idea of what we do and how much we earn, certainly. And I think it's really important that we rewrite that picture. And we're also part of the future. You know, we're part of rebuilding the country, not just physically, but like, you know, in the right way. We need to be part of that, not just sort of assigned a sort of job of making things look nice, because that doesn't help anybody, I think, at the bottom.
Dinah, can I ask what you think the reason is some practices do charge give such low wages? What are the reasons we got there?
I think there's probably several. I think it's probably greed and ego. I don't think you should rule that out. But I think in a lot of instances, it's just, it can be, especially when you're starting out and you might be starting to employ your first few people, you're not really earning enough money to pay yourself. And you pass that hit on to your staff and expect them to help you build your practice up. And potentially you never make that money at the back. And so, you know, I think we need to look again at how the system works across the board. I think we need to be careful about giving our time away for free and when that is. And that's something we talked about a lot in the London Practice Forum, whether we would stop doing anything for free, but we realised that's virtually impossible in certain situations. And I think we need to be careful that our industry doesn't fragment again, and like it did in the last recession, and then you lose that skill and that ability to kind of grow your staff and keep them, and, you know, raise them up to a point where they are comfortably able to stay living in London. And that's a real challenge, actually, for the generation who are starting to have children and want to raise families, or, you know, have a bit more space in London, are really, really struggling. And that was before coronavirus, and I think it's you know, could get much harder.
I wonder if either Jake or Catherine or Hannah wanted to weigh in about that, any of those things.
I found for the Shut Sites Down campaign, like I said, we reached out to the RIBA and the ARB, and I didn't find that we got any support at all from them. And in some situations, architects were in quite the bind and stressed out about this particular situation. So I just think organisations such as the Architecture Foundation, we wouldn't, like me on my own or a couple of people on our own, we would never been able to get the issue out as far as we have done, and the Architecture Foundation to be able to put their head above the parapet and support something that could essentially have a negative effect on architects, I think was really brave, and shows like the importance of having these other bodies that are allowed to have a different voice and aren't scared to maybe be a bit controversial or antagonistic, I think is really important. I think for me, it really highlighted how important, and many issues that the 100-Day Studio has talked about, how important these other organisations are. So that's something that I've really come to value even more in the past couple of weeks. Yeah,
in response to the question of like our relationship to current systems and structures, I guess our belief is that like we really understand that. I mean, Dinah sort of touched on it, that like, you know, helping to build a practice, like that actually the workers themselves are the people that do the work and they prop this system up. And so when you're thinking about shut the sites, you know, there's a piece of legislation as kind of limited that our employment rights are in this country and that have been erased over time. You know, there's still a piece of, you know, health and safety legislation that was fought for and won for by workers themselves in the past, you know, still gives you the entitlement, if you want, you know, if you reasonably believe that you're at serious risk of imminent danger, then you can, you're protected by the Employment Rights Act to refuse to go to work, and you can't be detrimentally treated for doing so. And so when you're thinking about shut the sites in a state of a national or a global pandemic, you know, those construction workers, if they were organized properly with the kind of unions that you saw at the start of the 20th century, could have just refused to go to work. And that's like, you know, that's like where we believe that you know, they knew the risks that they were putting themselves in, but because they didn't have that kind of organization as workers, they weren't able to respond.
Absolutely. There were some sites actually where a group of scaffolders in Middlesbrough had created, I think they were already part of the union, and they collectively decided to walk off site. And by doing so, I think there was 200 of them. They managed to close that site down. So absolutely, the fact that so many people are self-employed in construction industry and aren't aligned with a union was a huge issue for this particular case.
I think the other thing that I'd really like to focus on is, I suppose, in relation to the sites, in relation to issues that are perhaps outside of the concerns of people working within architecture. So, for example, the long house cultures, but I know that both of you have also talked about other issues like the climate crisis and like other, the social impact of your work, of architectural work in cities. So I perhaps wanted to maybe reflect on the role of the types of organising to strengthen work, to perhaps mend some of the fragility of the profession, to enable other groups, for example, that we will be talking about over the coming weeks in terms of the climate crisis or things like that. To reflect on the importance of protecting workers, of building a kind of fairer profession to enable pushes for those types of other related causes. I don't know if anyone wants to weigh in on that first.
Sorry, no, you carry on.
And then after that, we'll move to the. After this, we'll move to the chat, I think. I don't know, maybe the union could talk a bit about.
You were really breaking up in that moment, so I don't know.
Oh, sorry.
Of the question.
That's okay.
Yeah, would you be able to repeat the question, Ria? Were you basically asking about the climate crisis and how, like, unions or organising as workers, you can, is that what you were saying?
Yeah, to create a better situation to enable to push for those types of changes as well, as a kind of underpinning, I suppose, for the rest of the series.
Well, for me, I'm just going to jump in, Jake. I don't know if I'm lagging or not, but I think the parallel is really positive, and it's something that I've taken a real positivity out of, because it is that moment of people putting their head above the parapet. So it's saying we collectively, as practices, as architects, as a profession, want to take this in a certain direction, and that there has been appetite to do that. It's not been a case of, one practice doing it. And actually the same is said for the London Practice Forum. You know, it's really nice to see that collective organisation. So I guess as a union, we're doing it at a worker level, and you know, we have all these different scales that we act at as a profession. So it is really positive, I think, to see the climate action being done as practices, and that gives me hope for what we can do for employment rights as practices. And I think the London Practice Forum is an emerging sort of it's a response to the worker appetite for that kind of behaviour as practices, if you will. So
yeah, and just to follow on from that, I guess for me, like, the kind of coming economic situation is a kind of, it's obviously going to be incredibly, could be potentially devastating for lots of like marginalized people, but it's also a kind of, it's the direction that we do need to go in the general long term, isn't it, of like not producing as much stuff. And if you relate that then to the climate crisis, I guess it's yeah, I wonder like what like past I guess for me, looking at the past of like labor movements, when you had following the war, or in the I think it was in the 1970s, there was Lucas Aerospace, the workers who were part of trade unions there came together, 10 different trade unions, and they were in a factory that was producing munitions, and they said, like, how can we produce alternative socially useful products from the skills that we already have? And I think that's the same thing that we need to think about in architecture. Like, we're building too many skyscrapers that sit empty, and we need to reimagine what our role in society is. And also, yeah, like I guess I was also thinking about how redundancies in the future, or the potential of less work isn't necessarily a bad thing if we redistribute wealth around the economy as well. Like in the, you know, in the 1930s, when there was big unemployment, there was calls for the 40-hour week or the 8-hour day to get more people into employment. So why are we not pushing for those same things now? Like, a lot of us are beginning to value some more, or maybe have got some more free time from this situation, others have not. And so why is this not an opportunity to push for an alternative world that we can live in?
Can I bring in some people from the chat? Thanks, Jake. That was a nice end point. So I always feel like in these Zoom comms, you always cut off someone when they just finished. But the chat questions, I'm fielding two. There's one here where it says, how does the LPF ensure all the practice members are abiding by their charter? And then I just wanted to turn Russell's, that was from Joseph, I just wanted to turn Russell's into a bit of a question as well. Russell makes a nice point. He says, to add to Dinah's comment, it is also important to appreciate that design takes time. Engaging with communities takes time. Practices who charge low fees are probably not performing these tasks, and it is incumbent on the client to recognize this. So, you know, haste is the devil's work. So first question from Joseph, how does LPF ensure that all practice members are abiding by the charter? And second question, how do we encourage clients, or how do we build, oh no, am I on mute? No. How do we, oh, Ria wants to let others answer.
I was just going to say,
so how do we encourage others to, yeah, so just to increase the question. I was going to say that maybe we could slow down. Oh, never mind. This system included needs to slow down.
It would have been, no, you
so how do we do that?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I've been ably helped with this, with Russell's been priming me, because I should say that you know, it's I'm feeling kind of nervous here because Russell's watching me and he knows this all inside out. But it's, you know, it's my chance to have a go, right, Russell? We could do this
exactly.
Because you know what, I'm your what's his name, Matt Hancock to the. If you fall under a bus. So I think, yeah, well, okay. So I'm going to answer Russell's point. I'm going to answer the point about ensuring the charter, and then now I'm going to answer your question, Russell. You're right. It's about taking time, and it's about valuing that, and it's about stating that as something that we do, all of us. So I think that's why the charter is really important, because if we keep cutting back and doing the bare minimum, then that impact is eventually felt by our staff. because once you've cut out the nice office, maybe in the perks, there's not much left apart from salaries. And so we can't be doing that. We need to be saying that we need the staff to do this. We need to value them. We need to not flog them to bits, which is what's in our charter. And that takes time and it takes money. And so we're sort of actively pushing back against, procurement models which suggest less than 30% on quality, for example, which is something that you do a lot, Russell. Make it really simple. That's just not good enough. But Russell, do you want to answer the one about the ensuring we're abiding by the charter?
Yeah, sure. So this question has come up a lot, and we don't at the moment have any sort of protocols for enforcement, and I recognise that's a problem. I think the charter really is intended as, for the time being at least, something to aim towards. We recognise that not everybody will have in place a mental health policy or whatever. Part of the purpose of the LPF is to assist smaller practices, new practices who don't have those things in place, to get them in place to comply with the charter, but also that over time the charter will evolve and adapt and become more stringent, and we don't see it as something which is fixed for years. It needs to be responsive to changing conditions, and I can see us revising it in light of the the lockdown and whatever. So yeah, I mean, absolutely right. At some point we do need to have a conversation about how we can ensure that practices who have signed up to this are complying with it, and some of that will have to come down to staff from those organisations, from those practices, alerting us to the fact that maybe the practices they work for aren't abiding by it. Now, I think, if you think about the comparison with the RIBA charter and the chartered practice charter, as far as to my knowledge, I don't think any practice has ever been struck off the RIBA charter or has lost their charter practice status for taking on unpaid interns, for example. I might be wrong, but I'm not aware of that ever happening. Yet we know that they do it. So there is a risk, of course, and we want to avoid being in that position where we're all, all the practice leaders are saying, this is, we sign up to this 40 hours a week thing, and yet we know that there are people working 80, 90-hour weeks. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know what the solution is. It's forums like this, I think, that are really useful for us to start to put together some ideas about how we might achieve that.
Right.
Thanks, Russell.
Yeah.
I just wanted to bring in Joseph, who had the original question about the charters. Joseph, you want to speak, man?
Yeah. I assume you can hear me.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I was just asking because all the it's all very commendable and stuff, but I've got friends who work for practices who are part of the LPF, and
Yeah.
I know for a fact that the charter that I'm looking at on your website now is not being adhered to. Specifically 2.1, commit to standard working hours and no more than 40 hours, and crucially the monitor compliance thing, which would suggest to me that either you all have a system or the website's wrong. So I'm just wondering how, as it's presented, you would accept, a bit like RIBA, you can complain and say someone's not following what they're saying, what they're meant to be doing. So that was the original question, because it sounds great, but I think that demonstrating you're sticking to what you're saying is a real crucial thing for building trust amongst staff you may be wanting to attract or things like that. So that's where the question.
It's really helpful to have you say that, Joseph, because we talk as directors, really, don't we, Russell? And actually, we're relying on trust and goodwill. And you know, we haven't talked before about, is there a kind of mechanism for sort of raising your hand and saying it's not, you know, quietly or anonymously, and saying actually it's not happening like that, and would we feel comfortable? We'll bring this back, won't we, to the meeting, that you've come up with that and not named a practice, which is useful. But I think that we all have to be able to take criticism, and we haven't got a mechanism for that to kind of other than through the normal internal grievance kind of systems within those offices, if you like, which ought to be robust enough for you to have to kind of like whistleblow, if you like. But perhaps we need to make it even easier for people to do that.
Yeah.
Can I suggest that maybe by default your members join union? That could be.
Well, I don't think that's a bad idea. I think I mean, maybe that would be a test of the practice leaders' appetite for the reality of what this means. Is that if we were to make a statement as the LPF, that we might require or might make I don't know how we do it, but suggest to staff that that this might be something they would want to do. Because I think I'm not sure of the figures, but it's something like 300 to 350 members of staff within the 21 practices and the forum. So it's not an insubstantial number. I mean, I'd be happy with that. You know, with that suggestion, and this would be the litmus test for others on the group, I suspect.
There's a question here that says, have you considered following the lead of the union and consulting with your staff on how they feel? Yeah, very much so. That's happening sort of within each individual practice. We've all sat down and talked about the charter. Like I said, coronavirus hit us just before we were about to start doing some work between practice members, sort of like horizontally, if you like, rather than like within our own pods. And we've started doing a few things on Zoom. But it's obviously kind of thrown us with that kind of face-to-face meeting and networking, which we thought we could really grow. You know, we probably need a long-term plan for that, don't we? But yeah, we absolutely do. They all know about the charter, and we've talked through it with them all.
There's a question from Amandeep. It's not on the chat, it's been sent in. It says, I think the element of enforcement is critical because architects / up-and-coming architects want to almost rely on the LPF's accreditation as a sign that a practice will have a good working environment. It benefits it is a benefit to the practice abiding by it. So just to turn that into a question, what is that sort of relationship of leaning on the LPF for a kind of institutional weight?
I've also unmuted Amandeep if he wants to add anything to that quickly before I respond.
Yeah, just to build on that, really, I think the whole concept of accreditation or striking off the register, as I think anyone as an architect or an emerging architect does when they get an interview and an acceptance in a new office, or at least I've tried to do, is try and get in touch with as many people as I know that already work there to gauge at what's it like working for them. And if I already know actually they're part of the LPF, I want to feel comforted that actually I don't need to do any of that. They've got great working conditions, they've got all these policies in place. I don't need to worry about working late nights, because that's almost something that's very difficult to get out unless you really know people working there. You might get sold this dream in an interview, and actually what turns out to be the reality is not what you expected. And I think there's a really powerful kind of idea that you guys have started, and I think the full potential of it is that kind of reliance on accreditation that gives genuine kind of trust to practices that they're going to be great to work for.
Russell, do you want to add that? We have talked about this, haven't we? Having kind of rings of involvement.
I mean, I think it's a difficult balance, because I mean we have also had discussions around the core practices. I mean, it is, you know, I understand the criticisms that it's cliquey, and you know we have to in order to not become the RIBA, we have to limit the number of practices who are members, you know, so because otherwise it just becomes this huge organisation that you know that is impossible to run. we have talked about the idea of making the charter or having people available so they can sign the charter or endorse the charter and list them on the website. But then the whole issue of compliance becomes even more sort of complicated and convoluted and difficult to enforce. So I would be delighted if it was seen as in any way influential, that people thought that was an endorsement of somewhere to work. I mean, that would be great. I would hope that we can create an environment where people who are working for the practices who are members of the LPF have some kind of meaningful way of reporting non-compliance so that it can be addressed in an open and honest fashion. We are, all the people on all the LPF are all friends. I mean, they're all, it's a relatively small group of people who generally all know one another. We should be able to have those discussions openly and honestly amongst us. And if there are people who are practicing not complying with the charter, then we need to have a way of raising that. And I would hope that somehow the message could get through from staff who don't feel that they're being treated fairly or in compliance with the charter, that they could raise that with us somehow. Maybe that's via SAW. I mean, that would be an interesting one, actually, because then it gives you that sort of that insulation. So it's difficult to identify who the individuals are, but so we could then raise a meeting without wanting to incriminate anyone.
Just to respond to that, it's joyous to hear you guys talking about the London Practice Forum. I fully support what you're doing. There is a parallel in what you're talking about there in what we do in our casework, which is there is employment law, there is the Equality Act. There are already existing structures to make sure that staff are protected in certain ways. And what we do a lot of the time in our casework is enforce that because employers don't do it. So there is this, the union has natural autonomy, and it shouldn't be, I don't feel it should be seen as a scary thing or an adversarial thing. I have come to the union as a solidarity member. Like, I have the best working conditions I've had in my architectural career, but lots of my friends still don't. I haven't in the past, but I sort of feel like it should be a default, because I think no matter what, you need a bit of autonomy, and you there's that sort of, there was a bit of a parallel there just in what you were talking about. I thought that even if you do it within the LPF yourself, like make it a system so that your staff feel like they are independently reporting to you.
But it's a pretty low bar, though, isn't it? I mean, what we're doing is amazing, but practices who are not complying with the law is a fundamental issue. We should be aiming for something higher. I hope the charter goes some way to aiming to something more ambitious than doing stuff that's illegal. I mean, that's where we want to be. It should be something it's difficult. It should be painful. It should be something that's difficult to attain.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I hope you don't mind me jumping in. We've only about 6 minutes left. And I'd really like to bring Elizabeth Husser into the conversation, who has been involved in setting up the architectural lobby in London. So I'm going to unmute her now so we can hear from her.
Hi, hello everyone. It's really nice to be joining you, and also I enjoyed this discussion very much, because the reason that the London chapter of the lobby merged is exactly all of lies behind all of the issues mentioned today that relate so strongly with our industry. And coronavirus, besides being like an unprecedented public health crisis, has unraveled the fundamental, in our view, inequalities in our profession as well. And what I really want to stress and repeat is how this discussion started, and what you, Rhea, mentioned about the link between construction and architects, and all of these brilliant data presented by Hannah about low-skilled workers, and how still, even amid this crisis, architects, we are kind of not protected, but we are kind of given a way to navigate even via policy, like formally, even if it's you know, on paper, institutionally, in UK at least, we have ways to, like through furlough, to navigate kind of this crisis, living outside all of the other essential workers that bind together our profession. And so also have targeted that by stating that their union is not has not as members only architects, but also all related disciplines or workers that make our work or that an architectural office relates to. So the lobby, as you said very well, in 2013 emerged due to this Zaha Hadid quote. One of the major, let's say, campaigns at that moment was to organize against the American Institute of Architects at that point, and the perception of architects, of star architects like Zaha Hadid, about how they deal with construction workers, or about internships, unpaid overtime, and all of these issues. At the moment, here in London, we are trying somehow to organize internationally, and kind of our major campaign is on power mapping. And what this means is that we are campaigning about finding our place and building networks, like with LPF. So recently with DECAN, or all of these, let's say, other ground organizing groups, because we believe that, as all of you mentioned, we should have a two-way reaction to what is going on policy level, as Hannah mentioned. But also ground organizing is very important to us. So organizing at your workplace, return to work now during COVID, and what that means, and how we should unravel that, what this recession that will follow, that is already happening, means for our work and for students graduating right now. So I think, I don't want to make it a bleak, like a very, because everything, there is always, but we want somehow to go beyond surveying, beyond data. It's an amazing work, like the union is doing, surveying their members. We have done that as well. But we want to bring back our projects for just design, for trying to monitor and bringing forward and call out. Why not call out all of the practices that are doing it right, or schools of architectures that are doing it right, groundwork organizing, or organizers that are doing it right, and somehow bring them into our power mapping campaign. And we hopefully will release that soon, and it's a tool that we believe very much.